Hi, everyone. Welcome. I think we'll start in just a moment once we have a few more people here. But if you want to say hi in the chat and let us know who's here, where you're coming from, it's an honor to be here with you this afternoon. And I recognize some folks in the chat and some folks I don't know yet. So one norm we'd love to invite in today's discussion. Neither Ryan nor I gets too thrown off by having some extra threads woven into the conversation. And so please, let's use the chat actively. We will have time for Q&A at the end, but I think Zoom feels a little more lively and the Q&A feels a little more lively if it's been bubbling up questions and conversation the whole time. So when we put something up on the slides that you profoundly disagree with, jump on in. If you have questions, we'll try to weave things into our discussion as we can. And whatever we don't manage to, we can come back to in the question and answer session. Ryan, should we get started? Do you want to
Sure.
introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone. My name's Ryan Rish. I'm an associate professor of English education and new literacies at the University of Buffalo. We'll talk. I guess we'll talk more, right? Go ahead, Chris.
Sure, yeah. So I'm Chris Proctor. I'm assistant professor at University of Buffalo, same department, so we're colleagues. I'm in the field of learning sciences. I do a lot of work in computer science education, although I used to be a high school English teacher, and a lot of my research draws on new literacies research. So it was really exciting to have the invitation from Ryan to collaborate on the chapter that we wrote, which is the basis of this presentation.
Yeah, so Chris and I share that background as high school English teachers. And my research has led me in an ethnographic direction to really want to understand how literacy works in the lives of youth across different social contexts. And so much of what I'll be presenting today comes from the field of adolescent literacies and how we understand what that means and the implications for youth. I didn't know too much about AI though, so I sought out Chris because I wanted to know more, and I wanted to know more about the fields that he's working in and how they're thinking about these things.
And as a sort of like dabbling scholar in literacies, it was fun to have a chance to work with Ryan, who's has his bona fides in the field, a little more depth. So as we jump in, I'm going to post in the chat two links. One is a link to the slides if you're the sort of person who gets impatient and likes to click around, and also a link to the chapter if you are interested in reading more. So I'm going to go ahead and present. Let's see if I can get the right. Ooh, hold on. I'm doing great. All right, there it is. Ryan, is that looking okay?
Yep.
So to sort of get ourselves, and if you're calling in from a phone or something, I don't know, there's QR codes. Yeah. So where are we at? The status quo. AI is all over the place. It's blown up in the last few years. As a computer scientist, I have a different conversation around AI. This whole thing, it seems sort of bizarre, but that's not the conversation we're having here today. We're having a conversation about AI as a social category, a social practice, something that has shown up in your life, your family conversations, and has messed up the conversations over dinner with your friends that you hoped would be about something else, right? In educational practice, we've seen AI show up all over the place. It blew up in the pandemic as sort of like, oh no, the kids are cheating using new tools now. Maybe we can use eye tracking to stop that. ChatGPT has put the field of writing instruction in catastrophe. There is no shortage of new things for sale. Are students ready for the age of artificial intelligence? AI literacy this is not my words. This is from a purveyor of such products. The collection of skills and knowledge that a person needs to understand, use, and critically evaluate artificial intelligence. A person who is AI literate has the ability to use AI tools to function effectively in modern society. If you've been anywhere near a classroom in the last few years, you've probably been bombarded with this kind of stuff. In the world of research, we have tons and tons of new frameworks coming out. Turns out if you can be the one who gets sort of the first big framework for a big new thing, the citations just roll in, you can kick back. Lots of money coming in, lots of publications all over the place. It's been interesting. Some of our departmental leadership has been at sort of steering meetings of NSF and of the Department of Education, sort of like the high ups, and very, very clear that this is where the research money is going. This is where the policy energy is going. Layered back by some sort of deeper thinking in the last decades around big questions like what is the future of work going to look like? Right? Clearly, there's a lot of anxieties around, is your job going to be taken by a robot? I think a number of sort of frameworks trying to tell us the big story of all of this research. One of them I thought was sort of, maybe Ryan will be able to pick up on this later, but sort of being like AI literacy. Well, it's basically just, it's a bunch of stuff. We can organize it according to Bloom's taxonomy, no problem. Know and understand, apply, evaluate, and create. Oh, and we should probably sprinkle some ethics in because there's a little bit of that going on too, right? And then in pop culture, the first thing, outside the classroom, the first thing to know is just we're using it. We're using it for all kinds of stuff. Uh, here's Replica in the top left. If you need a new conversation partner, intimate partner who doesn't get frustrated with you, there's your AI bot, and you can tell it to remember certain conversations and forget others and change aspects of its personality to which you object. So it's woven into a lot of our practices, our identities, hierarchies and categories like gender and sexuality and race are all in there. We're using it to do all kinds of new weird stuff, interact, get around. It's interact with the government. If you've been through an airport security line recently, it's taking your picture. All of this stuff, it's changing. How should we make sense of all this?
So this is, we can back up on that earlier slide for a second, just to pause a minute. So Chris and I really just wanted to pump the brakes because we've heard this before. This is a familiar song, right? So there's some kind of dilemma around literacy and youth in particular. And we've got a rush to invent some type of model that's going to resolve the dilemma or resolve the issues for them, not with them, but for them. And we're going to brand it as literacy, and it's just going to solve all the problems. It's going to improve lives. It's going to improve, all the kind of the tangential issues that are related. And so we're calling that the song, that familiar song, that familiar refrain of problem, solution is literacy. Let's roll it out, scale it, take it to the marketplace, right? And we'll solve all these problems for youth. So just want to just pump the brakes and maybe ask how we might work through these issues with youth rather than for them. And our essential argument is that the song need not remain the same, that we can change the tune. So if we go to the next slide. So this song that we're calling was first described by Harvey Graft as the literacy myth. And he's a historian, and he goes through a bunch of different historical examples about how literacy was seen as this ontological object that's either bestowed on people to improve their lives, to build civilizations, societies, or withheld in some cases, as in our own complicated past, where literacy tests were used to keep Black people from voting. Literacy was at one time a punishable offense by death among enslaved people, and so we're really trying to this idea that it's this autonomous set of reading and writing skills that it's kind of given to people, and then has all this other benefits, irrespective of who they are, what their place is in society, what their other social conditions are. It's viewed as a moral good, and it sets up this binary between people who are illiterate and illiterate. And so we've seen this literacy myth replicated again and again and again, this typical model, and we're afraid, or at least cautious, that AI literacy does not fall into this similar pattern. So what we want to present is a field that has been kind of evolving since the 1980s around identifying the ways that literacy varies across different social arrangements and people. We refer that to multiple literacy practice or literacies, plural, thinking about reading, writing, and related semiotic systems. They vary across social domains such as home, work, school, and they're situated and not inseparable from other socio-cultural factors such as identity. And they're imbued with power relations and ideologies shared amongst groups of people, and they're sanctioned or unsanctioned by various institutions. And so we're kind of moving from this familiar song to one that's probably less heard and one that we would like to emphasize here today. So I just want to differentiate a little bit too, because, I was reading recently someone who argued asked the question, has literacy, the term, outused its value or outlived its value, because it really refers to just about anything now. And so a lot of different places of commerce or fields of study have co-opted the term literacy as code for competency, or a way to kind of give competencies a status. So I offered this slide to demonstrate what we do and do not mean by literacies. And so really, when we talk about literacy practices, we're talking about reading, writing, related semiotic systems that are shared by a group of people. And so some of those examples could be around age. There's a whole field around adolescent literacies, people, Black immigrant literacies. It could be situated in a place, where that's the most salient piece. Valerie Kinlock's work in Harlem. Purpose, agitation literacies, restorative literacies, or the ideology is foregrounded in social justice literacies or the semiotic systems. What we don't mean is when literacy is kind of code for competency. And so I have a list of some of those examples, like baseball literacy, design literacy, food literacy. And I'm not necessarily saying that reading and writing and related semiotic systems are completely absent from there, but they definitely don't follow this kind of social practice model of literacy that we're arguing for. And they do get absurd in some cases where we're talking about vegetable literacy and pet literacy.
I need vegetable literacy. Let's sort of consider this in one kind of worked example that maybe your memory of computer science education and computational thinking and computational literacies has been completely effaced by AI at this point. That's old stuff. But I think that the most recent wave right before AI, a lot of the patterns that Ryan points out are visible there. And so we can sort of see the future in the past. Computational thinking in 2006 was presented as a universally applicable attitude and skill set that everyone, not just computer scientists, would be eager to learn and use. The poor kids who haven't been given computational thinking, if only they knew, right? They would stop using all this other stuff they've got and start using computational thinking, if only they had it. From here, very, very, and I'm a computer scientist. I love computational thinking. I go swimming and computer programs run through my head. But the arrogance in that term, right? The presumption that it's actually a social justice issue that kids haven't been given computer science. It's really common to see in even a couple years after that definition, computational thinking getting talked about in a sort of like slightly fuzzier term of computational literacy, which is precisely what Ryan was just talking about, of this bundling together competencies like skills, knowledge, stuff into a sort of fuzzy category of literacy. As I was trying to tease that apart, one argument that I've made is that computational thinking, it's perfectly fine as a construct, but when it comes into schools, what it gets used as is this sort of like bridge into other disciplines and bridge from school to home. And it becomes the sort of justification of why does everyone need computational thinking, not just computer scientists? Well, because it's necessary for all this other stuff. And there is where it's sort of like the literacy argument becomes useful, because we think of literacy as having this authenticity, this moral good, this universality. And so that got kind of taken up. And some of my work has been precisely trying to disentangle this and respond to that. In a piece with one of my mentors, Yasmin Kafai, we wrote, in our view, the question of what to teach in K-12 computer science need not have a single answer, but could instead have many answers grounded in the computational literacy practices of diverse communities and cultures. And on the previous slide, right, Ryan was articulating a number of those dimensions by which literacy practices are distinguishable. Slightly more abstract, drawing on Scribner. From what I love about these citations is they're 40 years old, and that's a strength here, right? Like the continuity of the song is actually enhanced by seeing how long people have been talking about this and having the same conversation. Points of view about literacy as a social good as well as a social fact, so something we need as well as something we can see people doing, form the ground of the definitional enterprise. We may lack consensus on how best to define literacy because we have differing views about literacy's social purposes and values. It's not something objective. It's not something we can necessarily define ahead of time and say, this exactly is what you need, and this is what you need to be prepared for the AI world that's coming in the future.
I was really excited to talk to Chris about this because I think you get a little skeptical after time of yet another thing being named literacy. And so I think, Chris, when I first read about computational literacies, I was like, literacy, I'm like, here we go again, yet another competency that's trying to be dressed up in the literacy label. But your work's helped me kind of understand there's more nuance to that and what you've been arguing against in your field as well as for. In that spirit, we wanted to offer up some heuristics that we outline in our chapter that come from the field of literacy studies or new literacy studies that we find would be relevant to outlining what we mean by AI literacies in the lives of youth. So the first kind of heuristic to think about is that literacies or literacy practices are situated in different social domains of life. Home and school were kind of the focal ones in the early research and literacy studies, but it also involves, community, the workplace, places where you play. And so some helpful examples to think about is that like the literacy practice of doing homework at the dinner table, you're physically seated, you're in your home, but the literacy practice you're enacted is affiliated with the domain of school. And so it's really helpful to think about in terms of context. It's not just physical context where the literacy practice is enacted, but it's the social domain in which it's affiliated. So I like to think about that. There's lots of studies about bedtime, reading bedtime stories to children and how white middle-class families tend to mimic the literacy practices that are found in schools around those repertoires of reading stories. And so there can be some overlap, right, between the home literacy practice and what's valued in school, and that could differ, right? So the way that bedtime stories are read or not read in homes can have a different relationship with the way that stories are read in schools. Also thinking about how language use is specific to a community or social group. Our students are constantly translanguaging and code switching across different social domains of their lives. And so those are all very sophisticated literacy practices that they negotiate and navigate throughout their day. And then we could think about posting to social media as not really bound by any physical location, right? Or any immediately present social group, but it's a portal through your phone is a portal through which you're accessing these different communities. And so when we talk about context, we can think about it in all those complex ways. And then thinking about how literacies vary within and across power relations. So some literacy practices are sanctioned or allowed in some spaces and unsanctioned or banned or discouraged in other places. So those contexts all have kind of ideologies that frame them. And so we can think about schools, which, in many cases, ELA, Chris and I are former English teachers. A lot of our curriculum and content has assimilationist ideologies that's trying to, get students to learn standard English and produce these genres that we have deemed to be, important, such as like the 5-paragraph essay, right? Faith communities could be framed around intolerance or acceptance ideologies. The workplace, thinking about like in sales and that kind of thing, could be framed around zero sum or mutual benefit ideologies. And peer groups could be framed around authenticity ideologies, where you're either more central to the language use and the activities of that group, or more peripheral.
If I can just add, Ryan, I think that this like I find this so useful, especially connections between literacy practices and identity. There's when you're thinking about stereotypes about disciplinary subjects, for example, it's so helpful to think about like, uh, for example, if like doing math is seen as a very white practice in a school, then there may be students for whom it actually costs them something in terms of their identity to do math, because then they're selling out in terms of other like racial literacy practices. And that's, I think, I find that like a very persuasive analysis that I've seen happen a lot. And I find it a useful way of thinking about, if that's a dynamic that you aren't keen on in the school, like what can you do?
Yeah, and very familiar to our teaching, right? And so like oftentimes students in our English classes resisting um, language practices or things that we're, literacy practices that we're trying to help them take up. And they're resistant, and they're not necessarily resistant to the assignment or resistant to us, but they're resistant to the institution that has positioned them and in particular ways. And so just trying to understand, right, what are those relationships between the literacy practices that youth bring along with them to spaces, and then the ones that we're trying to bring about. Sometimes those have antagonistic relationships. But also then thinking another heuristic think about is how literacies vary in scale and durability. So literacy practices can be very particular to a family. I'll use this example. My father-in-law used to initial the Wall Street Journal in the bathroom for my wife and her four brothers to initial. So you had to read this article. There's a pen and there was a folded newspaper in the bathroom, and you had to read an initial that you had read a particular article in the Wall Street Journal, right? Is a literacy practice because it had, it was shared amongst the family and had durability over time. We still joke about it today. But in terms of scale, I haven't heard of any other family doing the newspaper initial. Let me know in the chat if there's anyone else that heard of that. Versus literacy practices shared amongst large populations, right? And so we all can kind of relate to doom scrolling on social media, kind of going through articles looking for the worst possible news. You also think about durability in terms of how long a literacy practice has been around, right? And so, or recognized. And so some of them are very ephemeral and short-lived, and thinking about like passing notes in school. I'm Gen X, and just to fold and pass notes, and that was quickly replaced by, well, not even. I don't think it was until I was in beyond college that we had a phone, but that had a moment, right? And so that was literacy practice was short-lived compared to literacy practices that are centuries old. And I'm just bringing up the Catholic Mass as an example that has had regularity, slight changes, right? But it has a lot of regularity even across languages. And then thinking about, I think we're quick to, whenever there's a tool, we're quick to just slap literacies on the end of it, right? And sometimes it gets pretty absurd, where we think that the most salient thing of the literacy practice is the tool that's being used, but it turns out that literacy practice has other characteristics that are more salient, and we might define it a different way. And so, just as an absurd example, I'll bring up this idea, the literacy practice of high stakes standardized testing and the writing that we ask students to produce. There's, we can kind of unpack that for all its institutional value, the ideology behind it, all that kind of stuff, but we wouldn't necessarily refer to that as pencil literacies, even though that's the most, the essential tool for filling out the Scantron sheet, right? Bubbling the things. And so really thinking carefully about, if we are defining literacy practices, to what extent is the tool that's being used? That tool could be language, that tool can be, conceptual, could be practical. To what extent is that tool the most salient characteristic of the literacy practice when we're trying to name it and understand it?
And yet, another voice I want to make sure that we bring in here is that the tools are often powerful in shaping practice. right? And I think this is one approach by which we should be thinking about the ethical implications of the tools as they're designed and as they're brought into context and imposed on people. I think that, and we can get into that conversation more, but just reflect for a moment on how ChatGPT, which has everybody's imagination, right? And we're all thinking about what are we going to teach kids about how to use ChatGPT? How are we going to teach kids how to use ChatGPT? They have no problem. No one needs to be taught how to use ChatGPT. But there's also one company accountable to nobody, which has completely designed that interface. And there's a zillion ways that that interface could be changed that would very quickly lead to people taking up very different practices in ways that like they didn't really choose. And so I think if we're orienting our pedagogies around like teach the kids how to use ChatGPT, that the durability of that it's ephemeral, and its durability is completely in the hands of one entity whose interests might not be yours.
And I don't think that we're always honest with ourselves about the literacy practices that we sanction and support in schools in terms of their durability. Oftentimes, they don't have much use in students' lives after they graduate, right? And so it's really something for us to think about, even to the extent in higher education where the dialogue between secondary and higher ed is you're going to need this in college, and the students get there and like, yeah, I did not need that. So it's interesting to think about like what literacy practices we're sanctioning and supporting and what their durability and use is over time and across social contexts. And another thing we want to avoid is we saw this pattern develop with new literacies in particular, and it wasn't Lancashire and Noble's intention to set out to do this, but they defined in advance what did and didn't count as new literacies as the advent of new tools led to new social practices. A good example is how writing, there's a bunch of writing tools like wikis and Google Docs that popped up that allowed for distributed writing and multiple authors writing for a widespread audience. But this definition, they made like an a priori definition that was kind of this idealized form of literacy that we should kind of that was kind of considered again an ontological good or a universal benefit to all students irrespective of their other characteristics. And so want to be careful we don't slip back into that with AI literacies and other literacies that we think about, because it really pushes us back into this deductive mode where we have the idealized model of literacy practice in mind, and we go out looking for it. There's some people made their careers doing research this way, and then determining the extent to which, the students enacting a literacy practice had fidelity to the idealized model. And then we rank them and score them. And the tune, here's that familiar tune again, right? And, one of the issues with that is it's assumed to have universal value to all people, irrespective of social context. And so we want to think through that in relationship to AI literacies.
And the cutting edge of that, right, is like when you have the a priori definition, then you have the really nice a priori definition also of illiteracy, of people who can be excluded from privilege. You can justify not allocating resources to them.
Last point, this is kind of a fine point that may be most of interest to our research audience. But there has been some post-humanist perspectives on literacy as a social practice that have kind of broadened the considerations of who and what has agency, giving agencies to objects such as the phone or such as the computer in any given social arrangements. And again, just kind of want to pump the brakes here that not all agents or actors are equal in today's AI-powered assemblages and networks of literacy practices. And so we wouldn't necessarily equate the person using the phone as having the same agency as the phone itself necessarily. At least, I think that's the argument Chris and I are making. Feel free to push back on that. So we want to really be careful that we don't kind of slip into a kind of false equivalency where agency is equally distributed across all human and non-human actors in any given social context, because people aren't wholly determined by social semiotic structures. We don't want to suggest a kind of determinism there. And then people are unpredictable, right? So people do things for thoughtful reasons, and sometimes they just do it for whimsy, like for unpredictable whimsy. And so to suggest that there's that's the same is true for all the different things that are granted agency in these assemblages is I think that's a mistake. However, that's not to say that these things don't have some type of agency. I'm not trying to completely throw the post-humanist perspective out of the window, because we have seen how race and gender are coded into and associated with other variables in algorithms that replicate and intensify hierarchical outputs, discriminatory allocation of access and resources, as well as undue attention, surveillance, scrutiny, and criminalization. And so these things do act on us, right? In very inequitable ways. And so I don't want to discount that.
So it's often when you get into this sort of new literacies perspective, I think there's one temptation to be like, that sounds really complicated. Can't we go simple? In a lot of my past experience in teacher preparation, I found in a class I used to TA for one of my mentors, a course called The Centrality of Literacies in Teaching and Learning. It was all pre-service teachers were taking this course, The Centrality of Literacies in Teaching and Learning, arguing that literacies are sort of the main thing. And we're having conversations like this, and pre-service teachers sometimes are sort of like, I want to teach the kids how to read. like, like, can we get to like science teaching? I'm here to be a science teacher. Like, why are we having these big conversations? And similarly, in the context of research, there's a lot of pressure to sort of like get to the point in a sense. Like if you want to write a successful grant application, you really need to be saying like, here's what they're going to learn, here's what we're going to figure out. The constructs are certainly operationalized ahead of time. Here's what we're going to see. Both of these structures, the structures of school and the structures of research, are structurally very closely aligned with the autonomous model of literacy. The idea that you can define it ahead of time, you know how you're going to measure it, you know what kind of impacts it's going to have, you know the good it's going to do for people. And so I think we have a series of questions that we want to sort of pose to you in terms of um, so I think where I hope you're at right now is you're feeling like, okay, all that made sense. Some of that felt important. Some of that resonated. But I also recognize the need for teachers to do their teacher thing and for researchers to do their researcher thing within structures that might not line up super well. So what I think I'd like to do, if it's okay with you, Ryan, is to sort of run through and read all of these questions, and then we can open it up to the audience for a conversation. If the if we're not if we're not getting a lot of questions coming from people, we can take up some of the questions that are here and think about them.
What if we did the opposite? I'm wondering if they're not asking better questions than we came up with.
They probably are. Okay, yeah. So let's not even go to the questions yet. Do, does anybody want to start us off? I mean, I'm going to call out Tim Monreal, who's saying things in in the sidebar chat. I don't know, Tim, if there's anything that you have a brand new book on sort of post-humanist perspectives. Is there any part of this that resonated with you? Would you pose a question or a comment to us? I'll give you a few minutes. That sounds good. Does anybody want to pose a question or a response?
We can maybe do that first one that we have in mind.
Yeah.
Like how are youth already using artificial intelligence in the ways they may or we may not be aware of? I guess they was intended there. Wondering what people are seeing in the lives of youth, in their classrooms, communities, homes.
I'll share an anecdote if I can get this started. Not about youth, but I was talking to my mom recently, and she told me that she's been talking a lot with Perplexity AI and has been doing family history research with Perplexity that may or may not be true, but it has launched all of these quests and then was having conversations about like how to vote in the election, talking to AI. And I found that sort of startling. But I think some of the more like personal intimate practices, I've seen a number of people, youth as well, using these AI chatbots as conversation partners. I pointed out replicant before, but like even just to sort of think through like a what should I do? We've had these kind of internalized social practices for a long time of I'm stuck, I'm in a dilemma. Maybe you can write out all the pros and all the cons. Maybe you can do some journaling to sort of think about like surface the different things you're feeling about this. And I've seen people using ChatGPT to do some of those things in new ways. Does anybody else have an example like that?
Derek, you had your hand up.
Uh, yep. Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Derek from EOP. It's interesting because I've been like kind of like following this myself, and obviously we work with the college students, but I've been paying attention a lot to our students who are before they get here, right? Because we need to understand that. And one of the things that I've been like really kind of paying attention to is how is there the difference of like critical query versus critical thinking? Right, because there's this concept that, some other fun academics are all throwing around of like when you're playing with Chat GPT or some of these AI models, you're actually doing critical queries and responding and asking certain particular questions, right? So like say if I ask a question in this way, it produces a response in this way, right? So going back to some of your earlier pieces around like race and gender and those intersections of like how people are using it and what are they using it for, a few folks that I've been working with, that's what we've been talking about is how are different identities and different groups utilizing it, right? And then what are those norms and how do you utilize it, right? And so we've been seeing a lot of like certain groups of youth, like they might be asking it like how to build a resume, right? Versus some students might be saying how to build a resume, but working with it sentence for sentence, if you will, right? And those are two different ways in which how to use Chat GPT, so or like AI. So it's been more of these things of understanding like how it's being used and why is what I've seen.
Thank you.
Derek,
Ryan,
I'm concerned and I'll be out of my depth quickly and Chris can rescue me, but I'm concerned how static those language models are in the AI, right? In terms of their use having almost an assimilationist ideology where it spits out the same answer for the same person, irrespective of who's using it and why they're using it. Um, and then also not even taking into consideration different language variations. And so for me, there's like a linguistic injustice issue there, with these language models, right?
yeah, I mean, without getting too much into the weeds, I'm keeping a pretty close eye on development. Everything's changing really fast. But one thing I wanted to bring up here, Derek, is in this sort of like critical inquiry into AI. I've really liked the framing that our colleague Tom Liam Lynch, for example, has offered of like how are we interacting with the screen and how are we interacting with what's below the screen? And I sort of connected to that, a conversation that's very active in the K-12 computer science education space is to what extent do we really need to understand some of the computer science concepts? To what extent do you know do to what extent can we like actually understand what we're doing when we talk to this if we don't also understand embeddings and understand linear algebra and understand the training and weights and all this sort of CS stuff? And I think that's a sort of an open question. But just to sort of illustrate the importance of that, I've seen people suggesting, for example, I mean, we've all heard these sort of, these, shockingly racist things coming out of language models, and the purveyors of the models are like, "Oops, sorry, that's an accurate reflection. That came from the cultural discourse, but that's not really what we're trying to put out." So, but then all of the tech companies certainly don't want to take responsibility, right? They don't want to say like this is our voice. They're like, no, it's not our voice. But I've heard people arguing, for example, that the future of advertising is in AI, where you won't even know that there's an ad, right? For a long time, we have these histories of like, how come we didn't know sugar was bad for us for so long? Well, because, money. And in the same way, right? Like the biases of the models that we're talking to in all these different contexts they're quite opaque. And so how do I know that the way that the discourse that everyone's engaging in is being shaped is not being influenced by some people? I think these are questions that are concerning for sure. A number of thoughtful comments in the chat. Does anybody want to read their comments out?
I can jump in. So I spend time with teenagers pretty frequently, and one thing that I've noticed is the prevalence of character AI, and media like it. And it's fascinating the ways in which that's changed the fandom space. And to me, there's a difference between like engaging with media of maybe your favorite character and having a full relationship with them. And obviously, there's been some recent news about the potential effects of that. But I've just found that really striking and interesting that maybe it seems to be producing a different level of engagement and maybe obsession for some kids. So that's been interesting to me.
That's so interesting. Ryan, do you want to comment on that?
I haven't played around with it much. I'd be curious though to pull it into to learn how youth are using it within fandoms. There's quite a bit. It's pretty a lot of research and documentation around literacy practices in fan fiction and fandoms, and even to the extent that we encourage our English teachers to consider that as a genre of literary criticism and close textual analysis, right? I mean, nobody's reading text closer than fan fiction writers, right? And then the kind of conversation around continuity and character consistency and those kind of things that you know collaborative groups of writers and media producers have been having those kind of rich conversations, right? And so, yeah, I'd be really curious how that tool could be leveraged in that or used, taken up in those literacy practices, if not, you know, giving rise to new practices.
I think one sort of high level takeaway I would offer from this conversation, and hopefully we can continue the conversation, folks who are interested, is like I think we need a lot more listening, a lot less telling. There's so much telling young people like this is what you're going to need, but I mean, I have a master's in AI. I don't know what kids need. I don't know what they're going to be doing in 5 years. None of us know. So like, but that doesn't mean that school's irrelevant and there's no like what it means is like let's make school a place where like the changing emergent nature of literacy practices can thrive and where we can learn to develop a critical perspective so we can as we're coming up with new ways to do things as we're using like character AI in these ways that no one's ever done before, we're also modeling the sort of like meta literacy practices of thinking about like is this okay, what's this doing to me, is this like who's included, who's not included, all these questions that are the same questions that could continually be asked. And in my teacher preparation work, I very much argue for that. I kind of think into a headwind, right? Of the sort of like, well, no, we have the standards. We like this is what we got to teach, but we don't know. And I would like to see in the big picture our culture move to a place where it felt like culture was emerging from and growing out from schools rather than a sense that schools were always 20 years behind in like what they're teaching. Um, yeah, so I could say more.
I think Tim's next in the queue here. He raised his.
Yeah, I can go, y'all. Well, first of all, I really appreciate the conversation and even the last point that you made, Chris. I'm always struck by when you say, Chris, like, one of the things that, and this kind of goes back to some of Ryan's points too, but like we talk so much about like how to use AI, specifically Chat GPT, but we really also need to be thinking about, like what are the kind of really tension points that some of these things can produce. And Chris, you always say like some of these real tension points are really spaces of like democratic decision making, but so many of those things are not allowed in school, right? So if you think about like deep fakes, if you think about even the use of AI for pornography, like many of these things that could really think about like literacy in expansive ways about like how to think about life together are outlawed or taboo in schools. So I mean, I guess that's a little different than what I had intended to ask, but just kind of like how do we really discuss these broader socio-political contexts of Gen AI when many of these broader implications are not allowed to be talked about in school. So like the how to use becomes the easy thing to do.
Yeah. I mean, I could just point to some places that I'm really excited about, and Tim, you and I are involved in sort of envisioning a new school with a bunch of collaborators right now. It's quite relevant. But I'm excited about structural aspects of school that can be taken up now. I think it clubs and extracurriculars have always been easier places to make change because they're not tested and there's not as much like surveillance on them. But I came up in a school where student journalism was really powerful, and the student journalists controlled the narrative of the school, and the administration had to call press conferences to change policy, or they were going to get pushback from the whole school community with the teachers and parents in solidarity with the students. That coming out of that experience in high school, I think, is so profound in a like increasingly anti-democratic world. I would like to see student government having a role that's more than just sort of choosing what color will be the prom theme this year. But I'm doing a collaboration with my friend and colleague Jay Barber right now, looking at what kinds of policies do we have around all this, and how are they written, and for whom. I would like to see more spaces in school where the violence and harm that is undeniably being spread by these technologies in schools is taken up, and students in working with adults can figure out how the school community wants to respond to that. I think there's big change coming with respect to schools and cell phones right now, which is a whole other topic. But I think making space for those conversations feels important and healthy.
I would also add that, like reconceptualizing the classroom as this place of experimentation with language and different tools, right? And so increasingly, the classroom is one of the few places where we get people gathered across differences to communicate with one another. And, if it's around a text or around a particular writing task, but to think through different uses of language in different contexts for different audiences and allow them to get it wrong, right? And so like to experiment and to play with language and kind of include that AI among those tools. I'd much rather have them do it within our care and with our guidance, rather than have harsher consequences in other social contexts.
I see Odette, I see David, a bunch of folks.
Odette, would you mind reading yours? I'm just going through here. I'll read it for our sake of conversation. So Odette wrote, Odette Reed, young people are using AI and parents are not aware of it. As a result, they made it up in situations that they were not prepared to deal with. Like with everything else, I think that they need to be taught how to use AI responsibly. There's also a lot of ethics surrounding using AI that teens need to be made aware of. Educators also need to talk about AI with students, not just ban it.
Yeah. I'm in a conversation with a bunch of computer science education folks thinking about AI emerging, and one thing that has emerged as a sort of like sort of a theme in response to what Odette raised is there's also some folks kind of arguing of like, how is this narrative getting shifted, and why does it have to be young people's responsibility to protect themselves from AI? When there's so many other things, like internal combustion engines are super dangerous, and we don't teach kids like keep your hands out of them. We keep them away from kids, and so I think that there's that's not like I'm not going completely in that direction, but I think that is an important part of the conversation. Is like if when we recognize the harms that are happening from this, but then we sort of go right into, okay, well then how do we teach kids to be responsible, or how do we teach parents to be responsible? Are we sort of shifting the responsibility? I mean, like I'm expecting my first baby, and so I'm starting to think about some of these things. But I've talked to so many parents who feel completely powerless to shape or regulate their children's cell phone usage. They're like, I can't do anything, right? Like, as soon as all the other kids have phones, it's done. And yet the sort of public narrative is sort of implies that you're like not a good parent if you're not, controlling what your kid's doing on their phone.
And at the same time, like not kind of like taking this moral high ground with youth as well. One of my son's friends, he confided in me that she had used AI for almost all of her assignments throughout high school. And he was kind of presented to me as this like kind of ethical dilemma. And I was like, well, I mean, those assignments were probably like just boring and mindless anyway. And if AI could get an A on them, then I mean, it's yes, she probably shouldn't have done that and was lost out on some opportunity to, engage in some meaningful work. But at the same time, like shame on the schools for offering up these dummy runs that can be produced by AI, these brainless activities where they could just be outsourced to AI and the teacher doesn't even really care who's writing or any of the other factors. And so I'm always quick to defend youth when they get caught up in these situations, right?
Yeah, I think we need a lot more anthropological work, right? Of just sort of like let's study with young people what they're experiencing, what they're doing, what's happening. We don't, and I think it's going to be really tricky. That obviously there's on the one hand, like we're adults, we have, even those of us who don't have a sort of like mandated reporter obligation as educators in a public school system or something, we have a sort of responsibility with respect to youth, right? We can't just be like, good luck, we built a weird word for you. But we also, our sort of knee-jerk moral paradigms don't necessarily, if they don't see the situations that youth are in, then they're not going to be very helpful. I did want to take up a comment David made, connected, Ryan, to what you were talking about the sort of like kinds of assignments we're giving. And he's saying, I think about the kinds of assessments we ask students to do, particularly in discussion boards. If AI responses can adequately respond to what we're posing as questions, in what ways do we need to rethink or adapt what we're asking them to do? And this, I remember when I was an English teacher, one of my colleagues, her son was in a class where the teacher was automatically grading student writing with early AI tools and not telling the students about that, right? Or then they would be told. But she was so furious about this. She was so furious because in her view, and I very much agreed with it, right, essential to writing is that it's an act of communication. It's an act of making meaning for others to read and engage with. And when the sort of like big like disservice we do to young people when we just teach them how to like arrange words into 5-paragraph essays is that writing is about sort of like it's like a performance on command as opposed to a form of communication. And I think going back to the point Ryan made about posthumanism, this is complicated by the fact that non-human agents are part of the conversation now. But my hunch is that leaning into meaning making and creating contexts where young people can show up as authors of meaningful texts for each other as audience members reading and responding to their texts so that we're in a practice of sense making rather than just sort of lobbing stuff into the void is a good way to go.
Yeah,
Ryan,
Christy.
could I follow up with that?
Oh, sure, David. Go ahead.
Right. Yeah. So, in thinking about that, it's like when you taking that long view, taking the historical view, when writing comes on the scene, when the stylist came on the scene, there were people that were fighting the oral tradition, and we need memorization, and framing these in terms of affordances rather than, bandwagoning, right? And and I just think about the number of ways, I'm old enough to have lived through, the writing process, um, with going from typewriters to computers and how that fundamentally changed the way that we could write. My sophomore year in high school, or I'm sophomore year in college, I had two 20-page papers due on the same day. I hand wrote 3 drafts of each one and then had to type it up. the last paper, running out of typewriter ink at 11 o'clock, going to my friend's dorm until 3:30. When his typewriter went out, I had to break into the education building to finish it up. Now with computers being able to save the text, that kind of reproduction of the text over and over and over went away, right? And yet we didn't really talk about affordances of what was gained and what was lost. So it just thinking about that framework in terms of what we're asking students to do, if we can offload the kind of summary key quotes kind of a thing, which is typical of a discussion board, and instead, what are your takeaways? What are, like, going back to what you said, Chris, about the meaning making piece? I think it's our responsibility to do that, wide-eyed with our students, to be able to say, look, you can, here's a generated response, boom. What are ways in which we could do this now that we're asking them to be able to think in ways that we may not be, it may not be school sanctioned yet, right? Those kinds of literacy practices that they've been pushed, or that we're under pressure, or the teachers are under pressure for. So reframing that and asking that fundamental question, what knowledge is worth asking, right? That's really where, where an emphasis, I think, could be in this.
Thank you.
I'm resonating with Christina wrote, and Christina, feel free to read your question, but about teachers using AI to craft lesson plans, and then not letting students use AI to complete those lessons. It's interesting, just like what busy work lesson plan writing is beyond your first couple years, right? And so oftentimes we're generating these texts that no one's going to read anyway. Some secretary is going to check it off. I don't even know what the digital form of lesson plan checking looks like these days, but in the old days it was putting it in the file and checking it off. But
yeah. But there's other situations. Sorry to cut you off, but like I've heard of people using ChatGPT, for example, to generate an IEP plan, right? Like a individual education plan to recognize and then meet an individual student's special needs, when the whole intention of that process is to bring together the stakeholders and create a shared understanding. And a bit like Sally was talking about how, right, like the search committee is receiving all of these sort of, ChatGPT generated cover letters, and I sort of snarkily wrote back and is like, well, you can use your AI to read them. And you have this process where there's a bureaucratic institutional thing going on. The IEP, or the lesson plan that gets written, has some teeth in some ways. The application, is how you're going to get hired. But they're also, I don't know, is it too idealistic to hope that there's some sort of, human meaning making happening within these organizations?
And to Sally's point too, like changing what we value. So why do we value writing that is void of personhood, right? If you can't tell who wrote it, and if that person's life experience didn't shape it, then what is it worth? Like, I understand in certain strict informational context, but a cover letter or a personal essay, right? Yeah, I mean, if AI can write it, then is it even worth reading?
Well, we better break. There were a number of research questions we didn't get to either, but that's fine. I think the most urgent questions that really, in the end, get to sort of like, who's getting hurt by this? What sort of like new possibilities might come out of it? I think, coming back to the youth again. But we just want to really thank you all for being here and really kind of opening this conversation. And maybe I'll hand it over to Ryan to close us out.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Appreciate it for in particular challenging us and challenging our thinking. Thank you for the dialogue.
See you around.